What's up, everybody? On this week's Sportlight Podcast, we're going to talk about using sports to help our children be raised to be victors instead of victims.
Welcome to the Sportlight Podcast for parents, coaches, and athletes. The Sportlight refers to the time in an athlete's life when they have increased ability to affect the culture around them and the increased opportunity to learn life's lessons through sports. This podcast aims to help parents and coaches capitalize on their athletes' precious time in the Sportlight. The Sportlight Podcast is brought to you by Especially for Athletes program.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Hope you had a wonderful holiday weekend. If you're here in Utah, if you're listening to us from other places, hope you're just having a wonderful summer. And so this topic, it's going to be a short topic today, but it's something that's really important. And sports really helps us. It provides an atmosphere where we could teach our children some really, really important lessons, as we've talked about so many times on this podcast. And one of those is very countercultural right now. Right now, one of the things that seems to be a fad in our country, maybe the world, is to find a way to label yourself as a victim of something. And the problem with that might be that our children are being raised to think that life happens to them instead of them happening to life. And it reminded me a lot of a blog post that we wrote a little while back, and I thought it would be good to read and discuss it today on the Sportlight Podcast. So here's the blog post. It has always been interesting how two people or groups of people can experience the same circumstances but react in such different ways. One uses it as motivation, one uses it as an excuse. The truth is, all of us are going to be wronged and used and falsely accused. We are all going to experience the unfairness of life and will watch people receive things they did not deserve for good or for ill. Many of the circumstances we will face in life are out of our control, but one thing will always be within our control: the way we react. When we face difficult circumstances, we have a choice. Are we going to be a victim or a victor? Now this, before we go on and read the rest of the post, it reminds me of something that was used at Ohio State University a lot with some of the leadership training that was done there, but it's that formula we've mentioned before: E plus R equals O. And E stands for event, R stands for response, and the O is outcome. And sometimes when we get so focused on the events or the things that happen to us, then we aren't concentrating as much on our response. And so if we put this in a sports setting, for example, of course there are going to be bad calls by umpires, or of course people are going to get injured, or of course there's just going to be some things, bad bounces, things like that. When we put all of our effort and talking and working together as a team on that E part of that equation, the event, that tends to push our children, our teams, to have this victims mentality that life happens to them. When we focus more on the R, the response, then we're training our children that in their life, when bad events happen or unfortunate events happen or unlucky events happen, not to focus all of our time there, but to focus on the response and how we're going to respond, because both of those are part of the outcome. The event is part of the outcome, but so is the response part of the outcome. And if we can focus on the variable there that we actually have control over, our response, then it will lead to better outcomes. So the blog post continues like this. First, victims. Victims blame their problems on other people. They seem content with remaining in bad situations as long as they have someone to blame it on. They use all of their imagination, ingenuity, and effort to formulate excuses. The problem with having a victim mentality is that victims will continue to have a poor quality of life They will just have a great excuse for why their life is bad. Great excuses will never lead to a fulfilling life. Victimhood is one of the most menacing of mediocrity's traps. We cannot get caught in it and lead a fulfilling life. We can't train our children to be victims. We can do this in subtle ways. When we blame everything that happens to us or our children on someone else, we are raising victims. When we act as though it's always the coach's fault, the ref's fault, the teacher's fault, or the man's fault, we foster a victim mentality in our children. Much to our dismay, they may grow up to have substandard lives with great excuses for it. And so when I read that, and when I think about it, I definitely don't think about it from the perspective of a parent or coach who thinks I've done this perfectly. But what I have found is that blaming never brings about good outcomes. It keeps me embedded in the E portion of that equation. And my children, when I do that, when I start saying, well, the coach did this, or your coach did that, or your teammates did this, or whatever, I'm sending that subtle message to them that life happens to them, that they don't have control over variables that will lead to the outcomes that they want in life. So here's the paragraph that we wrote about victors. Victors, on the other hand, happen to life. They do not let life happen to them. They use their imagination, ingenuity, and effort to find solutions, not excuses. They set goals and work to achieve them in spite of the injustices or setbacks of life. They let failure become their fuel. They work so hard and have such a good attitude that their coaches have to notice them and their teachers have to give them a good grade. They are not doormats. They confront and conquer the injustices of life, but they do so in the right way through edifying conversation and work, not through pouting and whining and withdrawing. We need to train our children to be victors. When we have a talk, when we have them talk to a coach or a teacher and make goals, we are teaching them to be victors. When they complain about not getting a part or playing time or a grade, and we encourage them to work harder instead of feeding them excuses or entertaining their excuses, we are raising victors. I think we have too many victims in our society and not enough victors. Given the choice between having children who have great lives or children who have great excuses for substandard lives, I will choose the former. I hope that I can act as a victor and not a victim. I hope I can raise victors and not victims. And so that blog post really, it captures our thoughts. We spend way too much time worried about the events of life, worried about what's happening to our children, what the coaches are doing, what the refs are doing. And sometimes maybe a simple thing that has helped us is we've tried to strike a balance here, an appropriate balance between defending our children and our players from injustice and not letting them allow that to play too big of a role in their life. One of the things has just been concentrate on the R portion of that equation. So what are you going to do? My coach is being unfair to me. Okay, what's within your control? What can you do? The umpire is not calling strikes. All right. What can we do? What's our response to that? And so if we can focus more on our response to things rather than the event itself, we do a better job of helping raise proactive children who will happen to life and not let life happen to them. As Justin Sua said on our podcast earlier, that we've quoted a number of times, that we live life on purpose and with purpose. It's a very anxiety-producing thing. It is a very discouraging thing to live life in such a way that you are at the mercy of whatever happens around you, that you have no control over grades or over outcomes of sporting events or over playing time. It's very depressing when you just feel like you're just a weed blowing in the wind. And we are not. We can act for ourselves. And as we teach our children that through conversations after games, just picture getting in the back of a seat after a game, and maybe we can ask ourselves, where do my conversations with my children land most? Do they land more in the E portion or the R portion of that equation? And if we find that we're talking about events, about what happened and all these things instead of about how we can respond, then it may be tending to lead our children more toward the victimhood side of things and considering themselves that tree that blows in the wind rather than the person who affects the wind or builds a house to get out of the wind kind of a idea. So just the thought for you today as you enjoy your summer, make sure those conversations are concentrating on responses rather than events, and it will raise proactive children that happen to life instead of letting life happen to them. Hope you're enjoying your summer. Have a great week. Thank you for joining the Sportlight Podcast. Eyes up, do the work.
This has been the Sportlight Podcast from Especially for Athletes, sponsored by Coca-Cola. You can learn more about Especially for Athletes by visiting the website at especiallyforathletes.org. You can also learn more about the book, The Sportlight, by Shad Martin and Dustin Smith at especiallyforathletes.org/book.